The second aspect of information I want to talk about this morning is using information to assess programs. If you're assessing the efficacy of a new pharmaceutical now, you can't get it onto the registry in a developed country without putting it through a randomised clinical trial. That's because medical researchers have realised that if you want to know the counterfactual, if you want to know what would have happened to someone if they didn't take the pill, you shouldn't just assume that they would have gotten better otherwise. You need to have some other measure of what the world would have looked like if the person didn't get the treatment, the so-called counterfactual. In development economics now, this is randomisation has been seen as a real tool in order to improve the efficacy of programs. Development economists are randomising all kinds of things, from looking at the impact of new sanitation projects, different types of village governance, types of school structures, whether it's better to have a single high-quality regional school or local village schools, and a host of other sort of interventions, including sort of potentially controversial things such as a randomised trial in Africa, which has looked at the impact of knowing your HIV status on subsequent behaviour. In Australia, we've been more reluctant to use randomised trials, but the two examples that I think stand out are New South Wales drug court randomised experiment in the late 1990s, early 2000s, which gave us rock-solid evidence that the drug court was an effective way of dealing with people who'd committed drug offences, and that you didn't have to care about drug users in order to believe that. The taxpayer savings from a drug court process through reduced crime from those who are processed through a drug court rather than through traditional incarceration more than compensate the taxpayer for the additional costs of setting up the drug court. Victoria is now experimenting with teacher merit pay at an individual teacher level and at a school level, and it's doing that in a randomised context, recognising that there are proponents and critics of merit pay and that it's important to test both the theories. To test the theories that it might raise student scores, but also to test the theories that it might break down staff room camaraderie. So to look at the impact of merit pay on the annual teacher surveys the Victorian government does. And hopefully those results will be in soon. But there has been a general sort of reluctance to implement randomised trials in the policy space. It's true that there are ethical concerns that one would want to be aware of, but I think sometimes we have a tendency to overplay the importance of ethical challenges in randomising new policies. The best example of a context in which randomisation has been used in order to test the efficacy of a new intervention, which I think in ethical terms dwarfs much of what we might do in social policy, is a randomised trial called the head injury retrieval trial. What's good about this is all of you, if you would like, can now be participants in the head injury retrieval trial. Here's how you go about it. Go downstairs, walk out onto a major road and make sure that when the car hits you, it hits you head first. You're now lying unconscious with a serious head injury. Somebody will call 000 for you, and the 000 operator will run a randomised trial. Heads, they'll send the paramedics with an ambulance. Tails, they'll send the NRMA care flight helicopter. Actually, the CBD may not be ideal for this. They probably don't try and land the helicopter in the CBD, so you might want to sort of head out to Rushcutters Bay or something like that. But they are really running this randomised trial. The NRMA care flight helicopter comes with a neurosurgeon who's obviously, it's very expensive to send the helicopter, very expensive to send the neurosurgeon. Alan Garner, who's running the trial, has been working for a decade on thinking about the best way of dealing with head injury patients. His view of the head injury retrieval trial is that it will probably work. He thinks it may work, but he's got theories as to why it may not work. For example, it could be that paramedics are just as good as neurosurgeons at stabilising people with head injuries, or it might be that bouncing around in a helicopter does damage to a head injury patient that bouncing around in an ambulance doesn't do. So they're continuing this trial until they have 500 subjects, of whom a third would ultimately die and another third will be seriously injured. And they're doing it because it's important to know, in the context of allocating scarce medical resources, the best whether very expensive interventions work or not. If they can do it with the head injury retrieval trial, I think we should be open to trying randomisation in other contexts. I've argued in a paper produced in the Treasury Economic Roundup that we should have an evidence hierarchy and that when assessing programs we should think rigorously about different standards of evidence. Finally, I'd like to, in the context of information, want to talk about the importance of avoiding overconfidence. It is critical to have more good information, but information per se doesn't necessarily make us better off. The example I'm going to look at here is a report that was done by the Department of, I think it was Department of Education, no, what was the Department of Employment called in 1995, Nicholas? DEET, which was called Workforce 2005. They made, DEET made projections as to industry level job growth, and I've simply tracked those projections against what we actually saw. So I'm going to show you now a scatter plot. Horizontal axis is what they projected, vertical axis is what happened. If they perfectly project the results, of course, all the dots should line up on a neat diagonal line. Occupations projected to grow a lot on the horizontal axis, that are high on the horizontal axis should be high on the vertical axis. Occupations projected to grow a little, low on the horizontal axis should be low on the vertical axis. We should see a neat diagonal line. This is what we actually see when we compare the predictions from Workforce 2005 with actual employment growth. You wouldn't say that there's no fit whatsoever here, but it doesn't look as though if you were giving advice to a young person in 1995, they would have been well served by following Workforce 2005. Why don't occupational projections do very well? Well, because largely they're based off demographics. They're based on thinking about projecting forward past trends, and they miss the fact that, as Richard Freeman says, the employment and learnings of young workers depend more on macroeconomic conditions, wage-setting institutions and technological developments than on simple demography. Mike gave the example before of how the world of banking has changed. I think this is a classic occupation whose growth projections now look quite difficult to what they did 5 years ago. If you went back to the early 1990s, typists are one of the #1 growth occupations, an occupation that's essentially wiped out over the next couple of decades. And again, with globalisation, potential for companies to move offshore, that makes projections even less accurate. I think in general, if we're setting labour market policies, we want to focus on general occupations, general skills, and be very reticent about our ability to predict the next set of hot jobs. So I'd leave it there on information and hand over to Nicholas. Thank you very much.